So what all functions does the muscle has? First is, so automatically when you do any kind of physical fitness activity or strenuous activity or tedious activity, pharynx is a tube-like structure or a pipe-like structure so these were the components of respiratory system. And when you get tired or if some injury happens on the field, you should be able to understand when all the forces that is acting on a body is counterbalanced by the equal and opposite forces, then that state is called as an equilibrium state. So when you are balancing a plank over a stick or when you are balancing your notebook over a pen, you are always maintaining that balance. Hello all. My name is Rohit. I take physical education on behalf of Prep School by Vidhyaashram. In today's class, we will cover the second session of Fundamentals of Anatomy, Physiology and Kinesiology in Sports. This is the second session. That means there is a first session. So if you haven't watched the first session of this chapter, I recommend you go back and watch that session first and then come back and resume this session. Having said that, let's jump into today's session overview and try to understand what all things we'll be covering in today's session. So today we'll start off with understanding the properties of muscles. Then we'll study about various functions of the muscles. After that we'll understand the structure of respiratory system. And finally we will conclude today's session by understanding the structure and functions of circulatory system. So I hope you understood about what all things we'll be covering in today's session. Having said that, let's jump into our first topic from today's session, that is properties of muscles. So what are the properties of muscle? The first property of muscle is excitability. So what do you mean by excitability? Excitability is the ability of the muscle to react to a particular kind of neural activity or to react to a particular kind of stimulus. After that, we have contractility. Contractility is the ability of the muscle to shrink or to contract whenever the action is being put on by a person. Next, you have elasticity. Elasticity is the ability of the muscle to come back to its normal shape and size whenever a tension or the activity or the strain is not being put on that muscle. Then after that, you have extensibility. Extensibility is the ability of the muscle to extend to a particular mark whenever the person who is doing that activity or action desires so. So these all are the properties of muscle. So I hope you understood. Once more we will repeat what all are those. We have excitability, we have contractility, then we have elasticity, and finally we have extensibility. So these are the properties of muscle. Now let's move on to the functions of muscle. So what all functions does the muscle has? First is maintaining posture. The first function of muscle is maintaining posture. So the muscles along with the skeletal system maintains the posture of a person. The second is helps with mobility. So the skeletal muscle along with the appendicular skeletal system helps the body to move or to do any kind of mobile action. Next you have cardiac muscles which helps in pumping blood. Obviously we need not explain this much because in the whole body there is only one place where you find the cardiac muscle, that is your heart. So the function of heart is to pump blood across the body. So that also serves as one of the function of the muscles. Next you have smooth muscles which helps in micro organs movement. So whatever small movements do we have internally, we are talking about our internal organs, the things we cannot see inside. So the bowel movements, the movements in your neural system, the movements in your digestive system, all those things, all those soft movements and micro movements are there. Those are handled by smooth muscles. So those are one of the other function of muscles. Next we have helps with endurance. So automatically when you do any kind of physical fitness activity or strenuous activity or tedious activity which requires your body to have more stamina and endurance, there also the function of muscle kicks in, that is to provide the endurance. Next, it provides shape to the body. Along with the skeleton, it also helps to give a shape to the body. That is one another function of the muscle. Next, it helps in increasing movement range. Obviously we studied about different kind of movements, and also we will study further also about certain kind of movements like extending our arms, abduction, all those things we'll be studying later. So the muscles also helps with different ranges of movements. Next, it provides protection. So muscle also works as a protective layer on your body. So these were some of the functions of muscular system. Having said that, let's move on to our next topic, that is the components and functions of your respiratory system. So what all components and functions do your respiratory system has? So starting off with the first one, we have nose. Nose is the first component in the respiratory system from where we take in the oxygen. After that comes the pharynx. Pharynx is a tube-like structure or a pipe-like structure where the oxygen gets traveled from mouth and from nose and gets towards the trachea, that is again your air pipe. We also call it as air pipe. So trachea is your air pipe. So what about larynx? So larynx is your vocal cords. It helps you to produce vibration, which again helps you to talk. Next is bronchi. Bronchi you find at the end of trachea where it gets connected to both of your lungs. After that you have diaphragm, which expands and helps you to breathe or take in more oxygen and to process it further. Next you have lungs, obviously, where the oxygen gets separated from the raw air that you took in and the carbon dioxide is pushed out from there. So these were the components of respiratory system. Now we can go in depth in physiological wise, but that would be more of a biological part of that. But understand here, though we are studying about the components of biology here, we are studying it from the perspective of sports. That means you should understand the relevance of studying anatomy and physiology in sports. Why do we study that? So from the angle of sports and from the angle of physical education, you must understand all these things. Sir, why are we studying about the respiratory system in physical education? Because when you're running on the field, when you're doing physical strenuous activity on the field, and when you get tired or if some injury happens on the field, you should be able to understand the physiological factors and anatomical factors behind it in order to solve it. That's why it is important for you to know the different muscular systems and different kind of other systems in your body. So having said that, I'm hoping you understood the different components of respiratory system. Let's move forward with our next topic, that is different types of respiration. So we have two different types of respiration. We have internal respiration and then we have external respiration. So though internal respiration is given here first, let's start off with external respiration. Reason is because external respiration is very common. So external respiration is the respiration where the external air is taken in and then it is processed by your blood to be carried again across your body and across your muscles and tissues, right? So that's called as external respiration. Internal respiration is the exchange of oxygen and carbon dioxide and the various process or micro level processes that goes on after respiration inside the lungs, okay? So that's called as internal respiration. So external respiration is more of a regular respiration that we talk about in a day-to-day life, that is taking oxygen from outside and then the body processing it or the lungs processing it. But internal respiration is more of a cellular level and internal and physiological level processing of your air or oxygen, okay? So these were two different types of respiration. We have internal respiration and then we have external respiration. So hoping you understood the two different kind of respiration, let's move forward and study about the mechanism of respiration. What all things are involved in that? First is inspiration, next is expiration. So we have two components in that, that is inspiration and respiration. It is nothing but simply inhaling and exhaling. So inspiration is nothing but just taking in oxygen, or we could call it as just simply as inhalation, where the oxygen is taken in and then is processed in the lungs and then the carbon dioxide is put out. That is called as expiration. So we have two processes when it comes to a cycle of respiration, that is inhalation and exhalation. So two things are there: inhalation, that is also called as inspiration, and then we have expiration, that is also called as exhalation, okay? So I hope you understood the mechanism of respiration. Having said that, let's jump into our next topic, that is the circulatory system. Now when you talk about circulatory system, what all are involved here? We are talking about our cardiac system, we are talking about our blood, we are talking about our heart, we are talking about our veins and arteries and the things that are involved in the circulatory system. We are talking about the circulation of our blood across the body. So what all things are involved here? We will study about each one of the components and study what all role do they play. So what all are their relevance in the circulatory system? Having said that, let's just jump straight into the components of circulatory system. So first we have heart, obviously the most important organ when it comes to circulatory system. Next you have arteries, veins and capillaries. Now what is the function of heart? The function of the heart is to pump blood across your body so that your blood could carry required elements or micro elements to your tissues and to your muscles and at cellular level also. So you see here how much the whole physiological system of your body is dependent on your circulatory system and particularly the heart. Our next component is arteries. Now what is the function of an artery? What relevance does it have in the circulatory system? Now you see, artery carries the oxygenated blood across your body so that your body can have that micro and macro minerals or required elements that I talked about earlier. And if that's the case, what about the veins? Veins basically brings back those used blood by the body and brings back to the heart. So again, with the respiration, with another cycle of respiration, heart can pump back the oxygenated blood through the arteries again. So veins basically brings back the used blood, that is deoxygenated blood, and arteries basically pushes the oxygenated blood across the body. So you see here a chain process is involved. Whenever your heart contracts, the blood pushes out from your heart to the entire body, and whenever the heart retracts, the deoxygenated blood from the body is pulled back to the heart and then starts the another cycle of heartbeat, and thus starts the another cycle of blood circulation throughout the body. So you can see how each one of these elements are significant in a circulatory system. Having said that, let's move forward with the next component, that is capillaries. So now let's move on to a next component, that is capillaries. What is the function of the capillary? So capillary is tiny blood vessels that connects the arteries and veins. Okay, so basically they are tiny blood vessels that connects the arteries and veins in order to exchange required elements apart from blood elements and blood cells. And also there is one more fact, and that is capillaries are so small that not even a single blood cells gets to pass through them. So one more fact over here, capillaries are so small that even a single blood cell cannot pass through it. With that, I hope you understood all the different components that are there in the circulatory system and what relevance does it play. So now you see how much each component of the circulatory system is equally important for the functioning of the heart. Having said that, let's move forward with our next topic in today's session, that is the functioning of your circulatory system. How the functioning of the circulatory system takes place. The first one is preservation of constant internal environment. We are talking about physiology here, okay? So when you talk about internal environment, various processes that goes on inside your body is all taken care by the heart, because your muscles, your soft muscles will not function. Again, like we studied earlier, soft muscles are those muscles which help the internal organs to sustain and internal organs to carry out different kind of micro and macro processes. Now you can see that preservation of constant internal environment here refers to that. Preservation of the constant internal environment is referring to the physiology, the various organs. Like we studied about the function of various components of the circulatory system. So now you should know by now all the required elements that is important for the functioning of various organs inside the body is supplied by the heart. The various required elements, that means when I said the heart contracts and the oxygenated blood is supplied throughout the body, those oxygenated blood contains various nutrients and simpler compounded, simpler micro level nutrients that is required for your muscles and various tissues to perform better. So you know that the circulatory system keeps the internal environment supported with all the required elements. So that's the first function of the circulatory system. So the second function is circulation of blood. That is obvious and understood. We studied this earlier. Need not much explain about that because it is understood. Next is the supply of oxygen. Like I said, oxygenated blood is carried from the heart through arteries to the whole body. So that is there. You have supply of oxygen. That's the third function of the circulatory system. After that, you have transferring of hormones, regulating body temperature. You have total 5 points over here. You have fourth, that is transferring of your hormones, and fifth, you have regulating body temperature. So all the required hormones that is secreted by the endocrine system in your body is circulated by the help of this circulatory system. Next is regulating body temperature. So the circular system keeps your body warm and in equilibrium with the nature as a changing temperature of the nature. So you can see over here why that point has been mentioned. Blood is warm, it has a temperature. If that temperature is not maintained in the blood, then the coagulation will happen. What do you mean by coagulation? Coagulation means the thickening of the blood. The thickening of the blood, if it increases, automatically the pressure will fall on heart. So to avoid that, it is important for the heart to function properly. That means blood streams are going everywhere in every part of your body. So if the heart stops functioning properly, automatically rest of the every organ system will be dead. So by that itself, you know how crucial the circulatory system is. The circulatory system is the main supply of all the required elements throughout the body. So with that, we will conclude the relevance and the functioning of the circulatory system. So by now, you know the relevance of circulatory system. Now next, we will jump into a little bit of physics part of the physical education and the whole anatomy and physiology and kinesiology of sports. But before we get into the physical part of that, before we get into the physics part of that, let's recap the bio part a little bit. So what all we studied? We studied about the muscular system and its functions and various other components. Then we studied about various other circulatory system components. And then we studied about the respiratory system and respiratory system components. So I hope you remember all of that we studied today, and I hope all that I taught today is clear to you. Having said that, let's jump into the physics part of the subject, that is the concept of equilibrium. Now this might not be new to you, or you might have already studied this in physics. So what do you mean by equilibrium? When all the forces that is acting on a body is counterbalanced by the equal and opposite forces, then that state is called as an equilibrium state. And it also can be said that equilibrium occurs when the resultant force acting on the point is zero. With that, I hope you understood the concept and the meaning of equilibrium. let's now move forward with the types of equilibrium. So basically, equilibrium is divided into two different categories. We have static equilibrium and then we have dynamic equilibrium. When you talk about static equilibrium, the center of gravity remains constant, and when you talk about dynamic equilibrium, the center of gravity always shifts. That means the point on which an object is balanced remains constant, thus keeping the center of gravity constant. Then you have the dynamic equilibrium where the center of gravity keeps on changing. Now when you talk about center of gravity, what exactly do we mean by center of gravity? Center of gravity is that point where the whole mass of the object is balanced. Okay, so if we have a particular object which is balancing and another object, wherever the mass of the object which is on top is being focused at a gravitational level at a point, that point is called as center of gravity, which does not shift when you talk about static equilibrium, but which shifts when you talk about dynamic equilibrium. So in static equilibrium, always the center of gravity remains constant, and when you talk about dynamic equilibrium, the center of gravity always shifts. For example, when you go to gym, a person is doing headstand or a handstand. That person is balancing his whole body on a single center of gravity point. His equilibrium is not shifting. He is not shifting the balance. He is maintaining his body weight on a same singular point or at a same center of gravity, thus making that activity a best example for static equilibrium. So when a person does a somersault or when a person does a backflip or a forward flip, that time the center of gravity always shifts at each stage of elevation and jumping and again dropping down. Okay, so at each stage his center of gravity shifts, thus making that a best example for dynamic equilibrium. Okay, so what are the two types of equilibrium that we studied? We have static equilibrium and then we have dynamic equilibrium. With that, let's move forward with our next topic, that is center of gravity, which we already studied about that. What is center of gravity? A center of gravity is an imaginary point within or outside the body or object around which the body or the object is balanced. Okay, so what is center of gravity? Again, in a much more formal statement, a center of gravity is an imaginary point around which the body or object is balanced. Okay, so this you have to keep in mind. Once again, in a simpler term, earlier we discussed this in a simpler term so that you understand it better. How do we state that in a layman's term when you talk about? So when you are balancing a plank over a stick, or when you're balancing your notebook over a pen, you are always maintaining that balance. Your balance is always constant, thus keeping the center of gravity zero, thus making it a static equilibrium. And then when you try to run with that stunt being pulled off, you will see that notebook is about to fall, and constantly you try to adjust your center of gravity in order to balance that. So when you are standing and doing that, when you are standing and balancing the notebook over a pen, you somehow try to balance it and you were successful. And also it was successful because you balanced and you maintained the static equilibrium. And when you started to run, what happened? The control of the balance went off and the book fell off because the center of gravity also changed and the balance also got messed up. So that's the concept of center of gravity with the example. So once again, what is center of gravity? Center of gravity is that imaginary point around which the body or object is balanced. Center of gravity is that point around which a body or an object is balanced. Okay, so that was center of gravity. So I hope you understood the center of gravity, about the equilibrium, and also the bio part of the chapter, that is your respiratory system, circulatory system. I know it sometimes becomes tough jumping back and forth between different subjects, but also understand this: physical education is an integrated subject. It's a junction where all subjects meets and all subjects plays their part to form this subject. So you have mathematics in this, you will also have biology in this, and also you will have physics in this. So certain chapters will come and go where you will understand the whole concept. But the whole concept of the chapter title itself, that is fundamentals of anatomy, physiology and kinesiology, where anatomy and physiology is the bio part of the subject, and then you have kinesiology, which is about biomechanics and body movements, which comes more under the physics. So you have to channelize your physics part of your reasoning, and then you have to channelize your bio part of the reasoning to understand this whole concept better and to study the chapter better. So having said that, I'll wrap up this chapter over here. In the next session, I'll see you with a fresh new chapter and fresh new concept, which will be again equally interesting because you get to see so many interesting facts from different angles and from different subjects when it comes to physical education. Having said that, this is me Rohit signing out. Until next time, goodbye.